Warning, I say a lot of bad words. If you're under 13, you probably shouldn't be watching this.
This is what I live for, fighting your own kind. Nothing's more gratifying.
See you on the other side.
So a number of years back when things were a hell of a lot different than they are now, I was part of a small but very tightly knit community of YouTube creators whose main content consisted of video game top 10s. I've kinda moved away from that style of video because I just find reviews to be more enjoyable to make personally, but it was a very significant chapter in my path as a content creator on this site, even if I don't look back too fondly on a lot of my older stuff for technical and personal reasons. I bring all this up because I distinctly remember that a little known series called No More Heroes was talked about to fucking death in that circle. I hadn't actually played the games at the time, and basically all I knew about them was that apparently the second game's final boss, Jasper Bat Jr., was notoriously awful, and he must have kicked a puppy or something because of how much everyone ripped into him back in the day. It took a pretty long time before I myself ever had an opportunity to play the series, and I finally got it when both games got ported to the Nintendo Switch last October. Thank you, Suda51, now I can give my money to you instead of some stranger on eBay or Amazon. With that in mind, along with No More Heroes 3 coming out later this year, I thought it'd be fun to finally talk about these games and see what I've apparently been missing for about a decade now.
I know a lot of gamers out there don't have much patience.
You got that right. No More Heroes is about Travis Touchdown, a man very into video games, anime, and literally any kind of sexual activity you can think of. If all that and him living in a shitty motel room didn't give it away, this guy is a total deadbeat loser. Somehow he finds himself tangled up in an organization of assassins trying to murder each other after one fight puts him high up in the ranks of the UAA, which is short for United Assassins Association. When he makes his way into the top 10 after the first boss fight against Death Metal, Travis, being the gentleman he is, makes a deal with UAA agent Sylvia Crystal that if he makes it to the top of the ranks, the two of them will have sex. That is the driving force of the story. A dude really wants some coochie and is willing to go on a murderous rampage to get it. Either Sylvia really knows how to get someone horny, or Travis is just really damn desperate to get laid. Or both. Travis gradually makes his way up the ranks by partaking in ranked matches against the crazy and ridiculous assassins of the UAA. Given the premise and how many references are made to classic video games, No More Heroes is a lot like a bloodier and more raunchy version of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, though weirdly with a protagonist who's significantly less of a piece of shit. This is very much a game that's fully self-aware of the fact that it is a game, so it just goes apeshit, mostly with the game's humor involving sex, cartoon violence, and breaking the fourth wall, all of which is pretty much entirely at the expense of our loser protagonist. The game's setting is so zany while still relatively grounded that the humor feels perfectly fitting and organic to the universe, on top of, being funny. For the majority of the game, the main recurring characters are Travis and Sylvia. In spite of the fact that he's a total loser and an all-around terrible human being, Travis Touchdown is a fun and really likable main protagonist. He's voiced by Robin Atkin-Downs, who does a phenomenal job bringing this character and his hot-headed personality to life. Sylvia, on the other hand, is completely unlikable. She is a total bitch who constantly belittles Travis and doesn't show even the slightest bit of empathy or compassion to any of the assassins that die after a match. Now with that said, I'm not complaining about this at all. I think Travis doing everything he does, working mundane odd jobs, paying hefty entry fees, going on an endless massacre, all just for the promise of having sex with a woman who's completely awful in every possible way, is so goddamn funny. The boss characters, while they only show up briefly for the actual fights before biting the dust, were really entertaining with the little screen time they got. I'll be diving into spoiler territory, so skip to this timestamp if you don't want to hear it. Throughout a majority of No More Heroes, the actual reason why Travis goes on a massive killing spree is kept secret. Aside from being a horny dumbass. But more info about what's going on is gradually fed to the player as they get further into the game. As it turns out, the UAA was a total sham the entire time, and Sylvia Crystal is a con woman who basically tricked Travis out of all the money he paid to get into the actual ranked fights. And the reason he did everything he did was to get revenge on his ex-girlfriend Jean, who killed his parents. Oh, and she's also Travis's half-sister. Japan, what the fuck? This is a very odd turn of events, which given the resume of director Suda51, I can't say I didn't expect to happen. However, I feel the way that the big revelations are dropped is really confusing and hard to make a lot of sense out of. The thing with the entire UAA apparently being a giant fraud scheme confuses me a lot because how the fuck did everyone Travis murdered get roped into the whole mess? I know there's a part where Sylvia's mother says she's done this with other people, but it's still conveyed in a manner that I have trouble piecing together. Like, were the bosses here in on it? Did they all just agree to die or something? Did Sylvia con all of them too? Maybe it's a case where all that actually matters is that Travis got lured in by an empty promise and all the extra plot jargon isn't anywhere near as important as I'd like to think it is. I'm not gonna say this is necessarily a flaw because admittedly there's a good chance that I'm just a dumbass and completely missing the point here. This is Suda51 after all, he's known for being unconventional. But for a twist that's supposed to be this big revelation that changes the entire way you look at the story, to me it felt like a super throwaway detail because the game seemed to disregard it after some time and it was entirely ignored in the sequel. I will say that I do think it's really nice that Shinobu, the one assassin whose life Travis spared, ended up coming back to save his life, and that Henry Cooldown is a really humorous parody of rival characters like Virgil from Devil May Cry. Also, I like to theorize that someone in charge of Star Wars is secretly a big fan of No More Heroes given the lightsaber that Kylo Ren used throughout the sequel trilogy. Can't conceal that from me, Disney, I see what you did. No More Heroes is a hack-and-slash game where you swing around a very blatant lightsaber parody called a beam katana. The main difference is that while a lightsaber just cauterizes any wound or sliced off body part, a beam katana causes that person to start gushing an absurd amount of blood.
You're a joke!
So yeah, you should absolutely let your kids play this game, I'm sure they'll turn out perfectly fine. While the series doesn't have a particularly deep combat system, it's mostly light attack, strong attack, finishers, and random power-ups with not much in the way of variation. God, it feels so good. I complained in my review of Marvel's Avengers how unappealing I found the combat to be, but that's the total opposite case in No More Heroes. The combat is buttery smooth, and it feels so natural and satisfying to cut down waves and waves of enemies. Like, I don't even care that it's basically just the same thing over and over again throughout the whole game, I'm just so overflowing with dopamine during the combat, it never gets old. Like, the fountain of blood that spews whenever an enemy gets sliced up, God, that's so good. This weirdly feels like a way better Star Wars action game than the actual Star Wars action game that came out around the same time. I played it on Switch and I stuck with using a Pro controller over the original motion controls it had on the Wii, but I do like that you're given multiple options for how to play this version of the game. Levels are pretty minimalist in design, given that most of them are just a linear path from one spot to another full of enemies to slaughter along the way, but for a game like this, it works. It reminds me a bit of a warrior-style game, just with a smaller enemy count. Every boss fight has a relatively similar formula to one another. Introductory cutscene establishing the character's quirks and personality, followed by a one-on-one boss battle based around the whole idea of the character. While they all technically function the same way, being a grounded one-on-one duel based around finding an opening for your attacks to actually do damage, the game does a lot to shake up all the encounters and make them feel varied and distinct. And as someone who loves it when hack-and-slash titles have skill-based one-on-one fights like this, I absolutely love this about No More Heroes. The boss battles in this game are so damn good, for them alone this game is worth playing. Some are definitely better than others, Holly Summers is annoying as shit, and Speedbuster isn't even a boss fight, but collectively the roster is so good. My personal favorites are Shinobu, Harvey, Jean, and Mr. Sir Henry motherfucker. The latter in particular has such good build-up. After you gain entry for the 5th ranked match, immediately you see a large trail of blood from your motel to the location of the match. Once you get in, there's this weird mysterious figure you're constantly following throughout the level who steals your kill and then mysteriously disappears. Mysteriously. After remaining absent for the rest of the game, and right when the player would wonder what the hell all of that was about, BAM! Final boss time, leading to an amazing and really challenging final boss that's a brilliant parody of similar bosses like Virgil from Devil May Cry. In between the ranked fights, you do assassination missions and odd jobs to earn the money you need for each match, and this is where the game gets tedious. This part of the game has you doing so much back and forth and it gets mundane. First, you drive to a place where you can take a job. You can only do one at a time, by the way. Then you drive to the destination of the job. Then you do the job and either pass or fail. Regardless, you then have to rinse and repeat this for every job you want to do until you get enough money to drive to the ATM, pay the invoice, and then go back to the motel. This part can really drag quite a bit. I don't even dislike the minigames at all, I think they're really goofy and fun. It's just that the actual process to do them, I feel could have been streamlined a bit. Apparently this aspect is being brought back in No More Heroes 3, so I hope it's at least improved somewhat. One of the side missions is taking out the CEO of a pizza chain. I'm sure absolutely nothing's gonna come of that, though it's all worth it just to hear that text-to-speech program read out the boss's names.
Listen to my song.
still just a fight.
Damn, it had a bit of trouble with that one, didn't it? Visually, the game looks pretty good, especially for a Wii game from... Jesus Christ, almost 15 years ago, what the fuck? It has an art style that's a bit of a blend of semi-realism and cel shading with harsh shadows and a more gritty color palette than one you typically see in a cartoonish-looking game like this. While there is still color, it's semi-muted and a lot less garish, which for No More Heroes is a perfect fit, given that the whole point of No More Heroes is that it's a story about some dude living out what he thinks is an awesome fantasy, only to be greeted with very horrific and terrible consequences. It does a great job achieving what it's going for. While not a super graphically detailed game, it looks appealing and it has its own visual identity, especially compared to that PS3 remake. From what I've seen of Heroes Paradise, it looks fucking hideous. There are so many unnecessary graphical details to, I guess, make the game look more realistic and graphically impressive, but instead it looks like a fucking mess and it's a lot more difficult to make out what's going on compared to the original game. Also, god, the blood effects look like shit compared to the original. How does a PS3 game look worse than a Wii game? Though this version does have a few technical blemishes as well, mainly with audio. There tends to be a lot of audio peaking and crackling most of the time whenever you're finishing off enemies. Also, the audio balancing in general can be really bad. What? What? Huh? I can't hear you! Speak up! What are they selling? The soundtrack is pretty good though, and there are some absolute bangers here. The iconic main theme of the franchise, the demented, unhinged boss theme for Destroy Man, the ethereal supernatural vibe from Harvey's boss theme, oh, and of course Henry's boss theme. So good, so fucking good. No More Heroes is a damn fun action game and very much worth playing, especially now that it's available for a pretty good price on the eShop. I haven't played the original Wii version, but from what I've heard, this is a really good port that runs super smooth, and it's easily the definitive version of the game as of now. If action hack and slash games are your thing, I definitely recommend giving this one a go.
I know. Too bad there won't be a sequel.
Aw, no sequel? You lying bitch. No More Heroes 2 is an interesting follow-up to the original game. It has bigger high points than the first game did, but it also has much deeper low points as well. This game seems to be subjected to a fair bit of criticism when compared to the first game, and that largely comes down to Suda51's role in the project. Unlike the first game where he was the director, writer, and designer, in 2 he was the executive director. Basically, he was a lot less involved in the sequel, and in a lot of areas, it really shows. What the fuck am I watching? This game follows up a story deconstructing a character who thinks he's hot shit and awesome to show how big of a shallow egotist he is, and does so with a really straightforward revenge plot. Travis fights an assassin who's related to some guy he killed off before the events of the first game. The assassin, in his dying words, reveals the plan that he and the main antagonist put together to mentally and physically destroy Travis. Travis's best friend is murdered by hitmen, and then he finds his way back in the UAA, which is actually a real organization this time, to fight his way back up to the top of the ranks and defeat Jasper Bat Jr. to get revenge on the guy who had his best friend killed to get revenge on Travis for killing his family, which, by extension, Travis did to get revenge on Gene for killing his family. This is a video game sequel story about the protagonist's lust for revenge, because apparently that's a weirdly common thing, I guess. It takes a lot for me to personally find a revenge story interesting. It can be done well, but often they tend to follow the same predictable event pattern. Some person does something to upset the main protagonist. The main protagonist wants revenge on that person. They go through a long and grueling process to get said revenge, and then feel unsatisfied and empty when they finally get their revenge. In the case of No More Heroes 2, there's definitely some merit in the story's execution, but tonally, this game seems rather disconnected from the first game in a pretty notable way. The first game was silly, but still relatively grounded, while 2 leans way more in the direction of dumb goofy bullshit. You fight fantasy robots and supernatural beings and scientific experiments and a dream sequence. The first game had its goofy moments for sure, but it wasn't usually anything that outlandish. Destroy Man was just some superhero nerd with a dick laser. Bad Girl was just a crazy drunk lady with a baseball bat. Speedbuster was just an old lady with a giant laser. Harvey was just a Russian man who could do magic tricks. 2 seems to crank up the ridiculous factor quite a bit. As much as I love me some good old batshit insanity, I can't help but feel like it makes 2 less tonally interesting than the first game, and at odds with the darker, more serious subject matter of the story. That said, I will argue that it does thematically make sense for the game to be more over the top, given how the UAA is portrayed this time around. In the first game, it came off like a shady underground organization, while in the sequel, it's basically become this fucked up commodified sport event, which I do think is an interesting way to continue the first game's story. I'll also say that I do actually like the direction they take Travis's character here. I know a lot of people don't really like the fact that Travis is now seen as the badass cool guy he only thought he was in the first game, but I don't know, I think it's a neat direction to take his character given his arc. The whole point is that the bloody road he takes to get revenge wears down on him mentally, and more he begins seeing the humanity in all of the boss characters he kills. Realizing that this isn't some fun game, just people endlessly fighting and dying for the sake of some superficial empty glory. Eventually having all the weight of what he's doing crash down on him as he explodes in rage against Sylvia, the woman who ultimately roped him into the whole situation in the first place. Only for the game to immediately discard all of that with the final boss. God damn it, game. You could have ended on such a good note, but you fucked it all up. Gameplay-wise, it's just about the same as the first game, but with a few new beam katanas, more enemy types, the camera being repositioned for some reason, and slightly more intricate stage design. There's not much of a major difference from the first game, but Travis is really fun to play as in the first game, and he's fun in this one too, so I can't complain. Now, if we're talking about the other playable characters, well, this game has a bit of a weird bit around the halfway point where you play as Shinobu for a couple of stages and bosses, and Henry for a single boss in a dream sequence. Now to be fair, I don't think they play badly by any means. Shinobu's combat is fine, and Henry's boss fight is pretty damn great, but they're just kind of randomly tossed into the game for some reason. Why do you exist? Why are you here? Just to suffer? For what reason did this game just decide to have me play as a character with these stiff platforming segments, who also stops to taunt opponents after every combo, and then gave her 2 of the absolute worst bosses in the series? It's weird to say the least. It kinda makes the whole UAA ranking stuff feel superfluous, given the fact that you just ascend up the ranks at random intervals. Sometimes you only go up 1 rank after a boss, but then a whole bunch of assassins bite the dust in one fell swoop, or Henry and Shinobu just take out some of the ranked matches for you. All the job stuff from the first game is still here, but aside from buying cosmetic items and weapons, it feels kinda pointless because you don't need to pay for ranked fights this time. On the one hand, it does make No More Heroes 2 much easier to binge your way through, but on the other hand, the game feels like it's missing something compared to the first game. It just doesn't feel as earned pressing the continue story button as it does finally getting enough cash to fight the next boss. I can't say I missed the overworld because it was empty and tedious to navigate, but still, the bosses themselves are still great, but they definitely tend to vary in quality a lot more than the first games did. While I'd say the best bosses in 2 are better than the best of 1's roster, the worst bosses in 2 are also much worse than the weakest of the first game's roster. There are some absolutely incredible bosses in this game, especially around the end. Alice and Margaret are absolute goats in that aspect, but at the same time, a few bosses are just terrible. namely both Million Gunman and New Destroyman, who are annoying as fuck to fight because they're constantly out of your range, and of course, Jasper Bat Jr., an awful 3-phase final boss where each phase is bad for very different reasons than the last. Phase 1 is easy as piss, Phase 2 is straight up unfair because of the unpredictable nature of Jasper's attack pattern, and the fact that you can die instantly from being tossed out the window, which is a lot easier than you'd think it is. And Phase 3 has a terrible camera and this one attack that I have no idea how you even avoid. The whole time I just felt like Mace Windu being killed by Palpatine after what's still the worst lightsaber duel in any Star Wars film. I remember for a while there was some theory that this boss was intentionally bad to symbolize how unsatisfying revenge is, but if that was the case, it very clearly didn't work because Jasper Bat Jr. is remembered way more for being a frustrating and terribly designed final boss than for anything narrative-wise. 2's roster is really good outside of the bad fights, but I do personally prefer the way you fight bosses in the first game where you have to figure out when your attacks actually damage the bosses, as opposed to the second game's thing of bosses keeping their distance and you having to constantly keep up with them. That's more of a personal preference thing though. I still have a lot of fun with No More Heroes 2 in spite of my grievances with it, but it does feel like a bit of a step down from the first game in a number of areas. The music though, that's a definite step up. The first game's OST was already pretty solid, but 2's music is so good, like legendarily good. There isn't a single bad or even unmemorable track to be found. As bad as the final boss is, it packs some of the best tunes ever recorded. Also, one boss theme is just a complete diss track against Travis, and it's pretty damn dope. This game is worth playing at least once, if only for the soundtrack. It's genuinely that good. No More Heroes 2 isn't a perfect follow-up, but it's still a fun action title and a good supplement to the first game. It has its low points, but it has its high points as well, and I'm comfortable recommending both games as long as you're not bothered by all the violence. I know there's also Travis Strikes Again, but I think I'll wait until 3 comes out and talk more in depth about it then. It's certainly an interesting game though, and if you like either of the first 2 games, I'd say it's worth checking out as well. It's gonna be interesting to see what Mr. Suda has planned for the third and probably final main No More Heroes game. I don't know quite what to expect, but going off of the past titles, I'm more than confident that we're in for one hell of a ride. Until then, thank you all for watching and take care. I'm out.